The Israeli military says its forces have entered Gaza's Shifa hospital and will carry out a precise and targeted operation against Hamas. The IDF didn't initially release more details, but says it is taking steps to avoid harm to civilians and hundreds of patients and medical personnel that are inside. Joining us now is Eylon Levy, spokesperson for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, to discuss the latest on the battle over the Shifa hospital. Mr. Levy, welcome back on Forum Daily.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Are you able to share with us any of the details regarding those steps that are taken to avoid harming the patients and staff that are inside the hospital?
Of course, this is Israel's war against Hamas in response to the October 7th massacre, not the Palestinian people, not the people of Gaza. And we've really been setting the gold standard for counterterrorism in urban areas to minimize any incidental threat to civilians. I can tell you that not only for a month has Israel been urging and facilitating evacuations out of Gaza City. When our forces went into that hospital above the Shifa terror complex last night, they went in together with specially trained medical teams and Arabic speakers as well, to make sure that they're able to communicate effectively with the patients there and to make sure that we can deliver humanitarian aid to the people of the hospital. You know, over the weekend, Israeli soldiers hand-delivered 300 liters of fuel to the hospital because they'd been complaining that they didn't have fuel. Hamas had been leaching it for its own tunnels and bunkers under the hospital, and Hamas stopped the hospital from receiving access to that vital life-saving care. So now this morning, our soldiers delivered baby food, other medical supplies that they actually brought in a tank into Gaza City. And now they're able, together with the medical teams and Arabic-speaking soldiers we have there, to deliver that humanitarian aid without Hamas in the way to stop us.
And there's been a lot of debate around whether or not the hospital is the headquarters for Hamas. What evidence can you share with us to support that claim that Hamas is using the hospital as a military outpost?
First of all, this isn't just a claim that Israel makes that Hamas has a long-standing strategy of abusing hospitals to shield its military targets. Mm-hmm. The United States has also said it's convinced from the intelligence that Hamas hides under hospitals, and the European Union put out a very clear condemnation a few days ago against Hamas's use of hospitals and civilians as human shields. Now, so far, we have declassified a lot of intelligence pointing to the existence of a Hamas command and control node underneath the Shifa hospital. We've declassified our own maps showing exactly where the facilities are, where the generators are that are being used for Hamas's facilities. We've also released videotapes from interrogations of Hamas terrorists who were captured on October 7th, in which they say Hamas leaders and senior officials hide under hospitals, especially Shifa, in which they say that Hamas has its own ambulances that it uses to transport its own terrorists and weapons. And when asked, why do you use ambulances, the Hamas terrorist tells the interrogator, it's an astonishing quote, he says, the Jews don't bomb ambulances. So the evidence is there, and we very much hope that when conditions allow, we'll be able to bring the international media in there as well when it's safe to do so and show them the evidence of what Hamas has been doing under there. By the way, we've already taken foreign media to the Rantisi Children's Hospital, where we found underneath it a room we suspect was being used to hold our hostages, a motorbike that may have been used in the October 7th massacre, weapons as well. That's been broadcast around the world on major outlets, and I hope that operational conditions and safety will allow for the same to happen in the Hamas control center underneath the Shifa hospital.
And so you're saying that the government will allow for journalists to enter the hospital if safety permits, or that your government will share additional evidence in terms of Hamas's military operations in that hospital. Is that correct?
We understand we're going after the terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. We've been saying consistently for over a month that Hamas has spent the last 16 years embedding itself under civilian areas. We've already exposed the tunnel shafts poking underneath children's beds, the rocket launchers leading to clinics and to mosques. And we've shown the bunkers under hospitals, and I hope we can do the same for the Shifa hospital as well. This is, of course, I should remind you, still an active war zone, though.
Of course. And what implication does that have for the NGOs and humanitarian organizations who've operated in that hospital for years?
Well, I think the world needs to demand accountability from the UN agencies and international officials who knew and said nothing. because they knew this was Gaza's biggest open secret, that the hospitals were being used to shield terrorists, that they were transporting their own terrorists in ambulances. We suspect they knew and they did nothing. And I think that a lot of international officials are going to look very, 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 very silly when the full evidence of Hamas's takeover of the Shifa hospital becomes available and people ask, why didn't you say anything? You know, this isn't just a historical issue, it's ongoing now.
Mr. Levy, we know that late last night an announcement was made that fuel will now be allowed to go into Gaza. What has led the Israeli government to change its position on this?
Israel has allowed, as of today, trucks delivering humanitarian aid to be refueled at the Rafah border crossing. It's important for us that aid reach the people, the civilians of the Gaza Strip who need that aid. That is part of our obligation to facilitate life-saving humanitarian aid to civilians on one condition, that it not be allowed to reach Hamas. Hamas must not exploit the international community's goodwill in order to fuel its war machine, and we'll continue doing everything that we can to make sure the aid reaches the uninvolved, non-combatant civilians in Gaza and doesn't reach Hamas. So we're talking about humanitarian aid trucks that are being refueled at the border.
I'd like to shift gears here a little bit to the news that we reported on, among many others, from yesterday. Canadian Vivian Silver, whose remains were just identified as a victim of October 7th. Why did it take so long to identify her remains? And I know you may not be able to speak to her specific case, but generally, why has it taken so long to identify those who perished?
This is a truly heartbreaking story. Vivian Silver was an incredible woman, a veteran peace activist who dedicated her life to peace, to trying to help the people of Gaza. She volunteered to drive people from the Erez border crossing to hospitals inside Israel for medical care, and she was brutally massacred on October 7th. I can't speak specifically to Mrs. Silver's case. We'll have to respect the privacy of the family. But it's important to understand what happened on October 7th. Hamas incinerated people alive. Hamas turned them into the sort of human ash that the world hasn't seen since Auschwitz. We've had children who can only be identified by their teeth. We've had people who were so brutally incinerated, elderly people, that they could only be identified by their dental implants. Nothing biological survived of them. The situation is so extreme that the Israeli Defense Forces have had to bring in archaeologists, forensic archaeologists who are used to digging through the rubble of Jerusalem from 2,000 years ago, so they can use their archaeological techniques to sift through the ashes on the floor of the burned houses in Be'eri and try to identify human remains, sieving them just as you would sieve through sand at an archaeological site. That was how brutally Hamas massacred people and mutilated and destroyed their bodies on October 7th. And if I could add, I think if there's one thing perhaps the world doesn't understand about what is happening in Israel now as the news cycle moves on and we get new images from Gaza, for all of us here in Israel, the date is still October 7th. While we're still identifying victims' bodies, while we have 240 hostages inside the Gaza Strip, including children, including babies, time has stood still. The date for us is still October 7th.
And do you have any indication on how many people have yet to be identified in this process?
I don't have exact numbers, but we're doing everything we can to identify all the remains. There are still people who are missing, of course, raising questions about whether they were abducted into the Gaza Strip or whether Hamas simply disposed of their bodies, burned their bodies to ash. It's a horrific, gruesome situation, and I can't believe we're even having this discussion right now.
You've mentioned that the goal of the Israeli military is to destroy Hamas. Many would argue, understandably so. But what does Gaza look like? We have about a minute and a half left. What does Gaza look like in a world without Hamas?
Well, we hope that the day after Hamas will give the Palestinian people new opportunities to take a different path that doesn't include terrorism. Terrorism is a dead end. And we hope that the day after Hamas, three things are going to happen. One, the Gaza Strip will be demilitarized. It will never again host a terrorist entity able to pose a threat to our people. Two, the Gaza Strip must be de-radicalized. Just as Germany and Japan were de-radicalized after the Second World War, now they're prosperous, powerful democracies and US allies, the Gaza Strip must be de-radicalized as well. We can't have another generation of Palestinian children growing up on a diet of hatred and indoctrination, this ideology of from the river to the sea that leaves no space for a sovereign state of Israel. It must go. And the third thing, of course, the Gaza Strip will have to be rebuilt. And it will have to be rebuilt in a way that ensures the concrete goes to people's homes and doesn't get diverted into tunnels as it did after the 2014 war. We hope that the day after Hamas, the whole world is going to learn lessons to make sure that nothing like what happened in the Gaza Strip will ever return again, will bring security for the people of Israel and new opportunities for the people of the Gaza Strip.
Mr. Levy, thank you very much for joining us on Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.